Hello all of you lovely people, Jules here for WhatCulture.com, and today I want to talk to you about horror movies, or more specifically about horror movie deaths that were, well, let's just say unintentionally hilarious. You see, this is the thing about horror, it's actually very close to comedy. What one person might find absolutely terrifying, other people might just sit around and laugh at, and because of the nature of presenting these sort of things on the screen, it does mean that sometimes even the best laid plans come off as just solid punchlines. So let's take a look at some horror films that tried their best to scare us, but unfortunately ended up making us laugh. As I'm Jules, this is WhatCulture.com, and these are horror movie deaths that weren't meant to be funny, but were. Michael Myers kills someone with a gun. Halloween 4. When Halloween became a hit, it reinvigorated the slasher genre, spawning similar horror series such as Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Although serial killers like Freddy Krueger and Jason Voorhees became popular due to their over-elaborate murders, the recurring villain of the Halloween series, Michael Myers, usually killed his victims much more conventionally. After interest in the franchise waned, Michael's murders became more over-the-top. Instead of hacking his victims with a butcher knife, he would fry them on an electric grid or bore his finger right through their skull. But one of Michael's funniest kills occurs in Halloween 4, when Michael murders a woman with a double-barreled shotgun. Now, if you think that sounds out of character for Michael to use a firearm, trust me, it's much more dumb than you can actually imagine. Michael doesn't just shoot her with the gun, he stabs her with it. He shoves the weapon so violently through the woman it pierces the door behind her, impaling her to it. The albino spider. Verotika. Verotika is an anthology horror movie based on the Verotic comic series. In the first story, the albino spider of Dajet, a prostitute's breast cries a tear, yes, you heard me right, which lands on a spider, and then mutates it into a giant human/arachnid hybrid. And this is how the movie starts. So, when the woman then goes to sleep, this spider entity manifests itself and prowls the street to find sex workers to kill. When the woman realizes this, she believes that the only way to destroy the monster is to take her own life. She swallows some pills and calls the police to tell them to come to her apartment, and when they barge in, they shoot the spider creature to death. The woman's sacrifice is meant to be noble and poignant, but it comes across as hilarious and rather nonsensical. I mean, first off, her breasts have eyes and it's never explained why, plus the spider monster kind of looks like a six-armed Pennywise. Also, the seam of the man's spider crotch is visible so you can clearly tell it's a costume. And finally, when the cops burst in, they shout, "Take your hands off her neck," even though he's not actually touching her. This film, I tell ya. Eye Popper, Friday the 13th Part 3. In the Friday the 13th franchise, Jason Voorhees usually slays his enemies with a machete. To avoid the films getting stale though, the murders in each sequel tried to be creative rather than scary. Watching Jason whack his victims into a tree or punching a guy's head off like he's in Mortal Kombat are intended to be funny. But there was one moment in Friday the 13th Part 3 that was meant to be horrifying, but unfortunately wasn't. So Chris is staying at a cabin in Crystal Lake with her friends and her boyfriend Rick, unaware that Jason is indeed on the loose. When Rick walks outside the cabin, Jason greets him from behind and squashes his head so hard his eyeball pops out. And because this film was shot in 3D long before Avatar popularized the medium, the director set up this shot because he thought that it would freak out the audience to see an eyeball seemingly shoot out of the screen at them. But sadly, it didn't work, because in this shot, the actor is blatantly swapped out for a dummy with a silicone head, and the eyeball is clearly hanging on a visible wire. Nice try, but no dice. The Decapitation. The Omen. When an unintentionally hilarious moment occurs in a horror movie, it's usually because of a limited budget, or an amateur crew, or an inexperienced director. But that was not the case with The Omen. I mean, it was made by the Superman director himself, Richard Donner, and had Oscar-winning actor Gregory Peck in the lead. And although most horror films at the time were deemed inartistic schlock, The Omen was an instant classic and even bagged an Academy Award. On top of that, The Omen has one of the most famous decapitation scenes in movie history, but not for the reasons intended. In the scene in question, an investigator is decapitated by a sheet of glass that flies out of the back of a truck. Although the tone of this film is dead serious, this iconic shot is hilarious due to the blatantly fake head. Donner was worried that viewers might close their eyes the instant the sheet sliced through the investigator's neck, so he showed the moment in 7 shots in slow motion using 5 different camera angles to ensure that we witnessed it. The Weasels. Dreamcatcher. So Dreamcatcher was the first novel that Stephen King wrote after he was nearly killed by a minivan. Now, once you learn this, it makes a lot more sense about how this story turned out the way it did. In the film adaptation, childhood friends Jonesy and Beaver find an ill man lost in the forest and allow him to recuperate in their cabin. When Jonesy and Beaver find a trail of blood under their bathroom door, they burst in to find the man on the toilet. When they nudge him, he drops dead, only to reveal that he has crapped out an alien that looks kind of like a shitweasel. Now, if you think that shitweasel is a ridiculous term coined by the viewers, it actually isn't. This is literally what they're called in the movie. There's nothing funnier than hearing the villain, played by Morgan Freeman, saying these words with deadpan delivery. These creatures are so absurd that you'd assume that King was trying to be funny, but in his own words, he believed that he would do for the toilet what Psycho did for the shower. In the years later, King did admit that this story isn't actually very good, and it's just another book that shows the drugs at work. Dr. Voronov is killed by a non-moving octopus, bride of the monster. Ed Wood is often hailed as, quite frankly, the worst film director ever, since his projects were plagued with technical errors, nonsensical storylines, laughable dialogue, and atrocious special effects. And one of the projects that he was actually the most proud of was the Frankenstein-inspired Bride of the Monster. In this movie, and I use that word quite loosely, Dr. Voronov is conducting experiments to create an atomic Superman. And if anyone stumbled across his work, Voronov fed them to his pet octopus. Now, the film concludes with the mad scientist himself falling into the octopus pit, where he becomes entangled in the mollusk's tentacles before being struck by lightning. Talk about overkill. Since Ed Wood had a minuscule budget of $70,000, which was ironically also the largest budget for any of his movies, he couldn't afford an octopus animatronic, so instead he had to settle for a puppet. So how do you make a giant octopus puppet look like it's attacking its victim, even if it doesn't move? Well, for Voronov's death scene, Lugosi had to flail about while holding the puppet's legs to simulate that he was being attacked by the creature. It is so evident that this octopus is not moving of its own accord that it is truly hard not to laugh. Isaac's death is ruined by terrible effects. Children of the Corn. In this Stephen King adaptation, a couple find themselves in the abandoned town of Gatlin. They learn that the area has been taken over by a cult of children ruled by a teenage zealot called Isaac. Now, Isaac ritually sacrifices passers-by, hoping to resurrect his god, he who walks among the rows. When his followers turn against Isaac, they place him on a cross made of corn to serve as the ritual sacrifice. Despite the fact that he who walks among the rows has been unseen up until this point, he has been built up throughout the story so that the viewer is actually excited to see this enigmatic entity finally unleash its divine power. And what does he do? He casts Isaac in a fuzzy special effect before blasting him into the sky. Now, the special effect used for this light is so dated, even back then, that it looks like it was made by a computer from the 1960s. And to conclude a horror film with the antagonist shot into the sky like Wile E. Coyote being strapped to a rocket is absolutely hysterical. The fact that Isaac resurrects himself 30 seconds later before dying again makes this scene all the more ludicrous. Corn on the Cob, Sleepwalkers. For the second time in a row, we have a murder that revolves around corn. Weirder still, both corn-related deaths were in movies written by Stephen King. I mean, that guy really must be scared of corn for some reason. Now, King has devised hundreds of bizarre stories, but Sleepwalkers might well be the strangest one. This film has literally everything. Vampiric incest, demons transforming into babies, killer cats, and cameos from Mark Hamill, John Landis, and Clive Barker. Each death also has such impeccable comic timing that you'd swear that you're watching a dark comedy. But one of the highlights has to be when a police officer tries to report a crime to his partner only to be killed by a vampire. But instead of sucking his blood or using her super strength, the vampire slays the officer by stabbing him with a corn on the cob. How did anyone working on this film think that impaling someone with a vegetable would be taken seriously? It is worth mentioning at this point that Stephen King cameos in this film saying the line, "I'm not taking the rap for this." And you know what? It's clear in hindsight that he was probably talking about this movie.